Good morning, Europe, and good afternoon, Japan and Taiwan. Welcome to our distinguished speakers, our global audience, and our viewers on YouTube to this virtual event on the strategic compass, where we seek an answer to the question whether the document is a helpful guide to navigate security and defense cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. I'm Stephen Blockmans, Director of Research at CEPS. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar, which of course comes amid war in the center of Europe and formally adopted in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The strategic compass has been presented as the European Union's guide to shore up security and defense cooperation between member states. But the Indo-Pacific, which was presented in last year's regional strategy as the world's main theater of geopolitical and geoeconomic competition, gets few mentions in the strategic compass. It almost appears as an afterthought. Is this a reflection of the EU's self-perception as a regional actor bogged down on the continent and relying on the security guarantees provided by the US and NATO, rather than it being a global player in its own right? If not, how then can the EU secure its interests in the Indo-Pacific through security and military means? These are the main questions that will entertain our debate. And to make sense of all of this, we are fortunate to be joined this morning by a panel of distinguished speakers. First, Alison Weston, Head of Division Partnerships and the Task Force NATO at SecDefPol at the European External Action Service. Welcome, Alison. Then Alvina Alamezza, member of the European Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee and shadow rapporteur of the Green Party on the EP's draft report on the EU and security challenges in the Indo-Pacific. Welcome, Alvina. Then Hideshi Tokuchi, visiting professor at the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, GRIPS, and former Vice Minister for International Affairs of Defense of Japan. Good afternoon, Mr. Tokuchi. And last but certainly not least, Susanna Ferenczi, postdoctoral fellow at the Ministry of Science and Technology in Taiwan, and assistant professor at the National Donghua University in Hualien, also in Taiwan. Welcome to you, Susanna. Now, the speakers have agreed to limit their opening statements to 7 to 8 minutes each, after which I will engage them in a discussion. If you, members of the audience, have any questions or observations, then please use the Q&A function in Zoom, which CEPS will curate to make sure that the most pertinent and interesting questions get priority. So with that, Alison, I suppose we should start with you. You're the policymaker after all, and the document at hand is the strategic compass. You're focusing on partnerships in particular. So we're keen to hear from you what is new in this respect in the strategic compass in security and defense role of the EU, in particular to the Indo-Pacific. So over to you.
Thank you very much and good morning, everybody. And let me just apologize in advance for my croaky voice, but unfortunately, I'm still recovering from a relatively mild case of COVID, but I will do my best to make myself heard this morning. And it's really a pleasure to join you. We're really enjoying now this process of discussing and explaining the strategic compass, and really, as we move into the implementation phase, also hearing from many of you in the think tank and academic community how things look from your side, because indeed, as you suggested, we have quite a lot of work to do to take this forward into the implementation. Just a few words very briefly on the strategic compass before I get into the Indo-Pacific question in particular. It's been a project nearly 2 years in gestation, and it's started off with threat analysis, which is a very new initiative from the European level. This was done in November 2020. It's a classified document produced by intelligence services. And this was something very new for the European Union because it meant we had to have serious conversation together about what we understood as the threats and the challenges on which we could base the work of the strategic compass. And if you like, the thinking captured in that is what you will then find in the strategic compass when it talks about the world we face. So this is the basis, if you like, the analysis on which we have based all of our work. And then we had an EU member state reflection process, more than 50 workshops. So a lot of speeches, a lot of panels, a lot of discussions. But this has been extremely important because it's absolutely essential that all the work we do in the framework of the compass has member state ownership. And it's more important in security and defense than perhaps in many other policy areas, because the assets and the capabilities that we're talking about in the end are those that belong to our member states. It's our member states who are responsible for the deployment of military assets, military personnel, deciding where to send their ships, deciding with which countries we take forward our partnerships, and so on. So extremely important that we had this extremely intense, very deep and very broad reflection phase. And the compass that you see, the document that you see, really comes out of that very long and intense reflection. And I think what's really important to emphasize, and this comes to the point you made, Stephen, about the immediate circumstances in which we find ourselves, the war in Ukraine, Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Clearly, this is taking high priority on political agendas for the moment and crowding out a lot of other conversations. But the strategic compass has a 5 to 10 year time frame. It's not only to deal with the specific crises and challenges that we see today. It's not a document that has a few weeks or a few months lifespan, but something that is meant to guide work over a 5 to 10 year time frame. So indeed, at the moment, we are extremely focused, of course, on what is happening in our immediate neighborhood. But nevertheless, the building blocks and the key elements are in the strategic compass for us to look forward. And in that context, it needs to be understood as a political ambition, a kind of declaration of intent. What sort of actor, in the end, does the European Union see itself as being in terms of security and defense? And of course, that's absolutely the key question that you want to address today in the context of the Indo-Pacific. It's not intended to be an answer to everything. And certainly there will be plenty of discussions about how it doesn't address some challenges or how it doesn't resolve all of the world's problems. But it is intended to change the way that we work amongst ourselves, first of all, within the European Union, between member states and with European institutions, but also critically with partners. Now, there are 4 chapters of the compass, one on ACT, one on secure, one on invest, and one on partner. So partner is, if you like, 1/4 or one substantial piece of the overall whole. And that's important because, you know, in the run up to the compass, there was a lot of discussion about strategic autonomy, about the European Union's ambition to be able to act independently, autonomously, what that might mean in practice, what that might mean for our relationship with our partners, how this might relate to our engagement with the United Nations, with NATO, with other international partners. So I think in the context, and the ACT and Secure and Invest chapters also set out a number of areas which areas of focus where the European Union will aim to have more capacity to act, more capacity to secure its own security for itself, its citizens, and in its neighbourhood in particular. But the partner chapter also makes it very clear that this work can only be taken forward together with partners. And I think that's very important to understand those two dynamics as part of the same whole. And I think quite often in the conversations about strategic autonomy and the controversies and the discussions about what it does and doesn't mean and doesn't imply, it's very often forgotten that the partnership framework or the partnership emphasis is also an equally important part of the work that we aim to do in implementing the strategic compass. Now, what does this mean? We're not starting from scratch. We already have quite a lot of established partnerships in security and defense, in many cases going back many, many years. We have a very long-standing strategic partnership with the United Nations. For example, we cooperate very closely with them on the ground between headquarters in the planning process. And in the compass, there are some ideas about how we can take this relationship forward. It's also not going to start from scratch or reinvent the wheel when it comes to our relationship with NATO, where we have a very long-standing and very intense pattern of cooperation as well. And again, there are some ideas and suggestions in the compass about how we can take that relationship forward. But as part of our overall commitment to the international peace and security agenda, there's also a commitment to work more with regional organizations, the African Union, the OSCE, but also ASEAN. So that's one strand of work, for example, that is very much mentioned in the compass, and it's up to us then to work out what this might mean in practice, to go into details over this time period that we set out. And then we also have the aspiration to develop further our bilateral partnerships and relationships with partners around the world. And I think here, what's really important to emphasize are the principles that the compass establishes for how we should take that relationship forward. First of all, it's very clear those partnerships should be tailored. That is to say, there's no one size fits all. The nature of our relationship with each country, with each partner, will vary, and that will reflect our interests, the sorts of conversations we want to have with those countries, the sorts of topics we want to address together, the sorts of values that we share. But it will also reflect the interests of our partners, because our partners in a partnership, our partners also will have their views of the nature of their interaction with us, the sorts of topics they wish to discuss, the sorts of policy areas they wish to pursue. And I think this is the other important piece, bilateral partnerships tailored, no one size fits all. But the other piece that's extremely important is that it has to work with existing policy frameworks. We're not reinventing the wheel. We're not having an overnight revolution, but our engagement with partners will build on what already exists. And that's important because the European Union already has quite a variety of very intense policy frameworks with different regions of the world. So in our immediate neighborhood, we have, for example, the accession process in the Western Balkans. We have the association agreement partners to our east. We have the Eastern Partnership Framework. We have many different existing policy frameworks that go considerably beyond the security and defence agenda into much broader range of policy areas. And our engagement in security and defence, of course, must be complementary with and coherent with those existing frameworks. Which brings us to the Indo-Pacific. You mentioned at the beginning the policy frameworks that were established last year, the strategy in April 21, the joint communication in September 21, and that was rather unusual as a joint communication for having this rather broad security and defence agenda included in a joint communication. It's, I think, the first, to my knowledge, that I've seen that has such a security and defence dimension. And what this means is the work in the strategic compass sets an aspiration, it sets the principles, it sets the framework, it sets the priority of keeping partnerships at the heart of the work of security and defence. But really, there's much more detail to be found in the joint communication in the strategy from last year. And those two documents need to be seen together as understanding the direction of travel and the nature of the way in which the EU wants to engage. And I think what's important when you see those two documents together is, first of all, as you mentioned before, the emphasis on the importance of engaging in the Indo-Pacific. And I think, yes, of course, the strategic compass has new language in it introduced to respond to the crisis in Europe. But I think there's also quite a lot of language there talking about the geopolitical competition in the Indo-Pacific region. And that's something, of course, that remains extremely relevant. We see in the discussions about how to respond to Russia's aggression, the importance, again, of engaging with China, and certainly very much part of the conversation in the EU-China summit of last Friday. But what we also see is that the security and defence agenda is evolving, becoming much broader than would have been the case for the European Union in the past. In the past, we had the very classic military CSDP missions and operations kind of agenda, looking at capabilities. That's still important. That's still very much part of the compass. These are areas where the member states' assets are engaged. It's extremely important. And there are elements here, for example, boosting our cooperation with Operation Atalanta. We've had some very successful joint exercises with partners like Japan in recent months and years. Very important tool for building partnerships, but also the new coordinated maritime presence. These are classic CSDP security and defense type instruments. But when you look in the compass and you look at the Indo-Pacific strategy from last year, you also see that the agenda has become much broader. So we're looking at cyber, hybrid, disinformation, emerging and disruptive technologies, climate and security, resilience, space, the much broader maritime security conversation that goes beyond the military conversation. And these are areas where member states' assets are extremely important, but where the European institutions also has an important range of relevant tools and instruments that can be brought to bear also in support of our broader security and defence agenda. So I think, yes, you will see in the compass that there is, of course, an immediate focus on coping with the challenges in our immediate neighbourhood to our east, of course, also in the southwest and in our southern neighbourhood. And I don't think that would be at all surprising to anybody. But I think, nevertheless, the partnership chapter of the compass, seen together with the world we face, the sort of political analysis at the beginning, makes clear that the sorts of challenges that we face over this time period, 5 to 10 years in the future, make it absolutely imperative that we continue to work along the work strands, all the work strands that we've identified, and that partnerships will absolutely have to be critical if the European Union is going to secure its own security. I'm afraid I've come to the end of my time. I'm also running out of juice, but I'll drink some hot drinks and hopefully be back able to speak with you for the comment section. Thank you very much, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Alison. But allow me to take a sip. Allow me to follow up with one question, or maybe an observation. Would you agree that it's fair to say that, in fact, the document is rather a roadmap on security and defense capability by 2030? I mean, the build-up of those capabilities by 2030, but not really a compass that helps reorientate the EU's trajectory to balance out interests and the geopolitical push and pull forces in the Indo-Pacific.
Well, thank you, Stephen. This is amazing. Honey and lemon, I can recommend it to everybody. Well, I mean, we call it a compass because for us, it sets a direction in which we want to travel. It sets a level of ambition. And indeed, as you said, we have this time frame to 2030 of the sorts of capabilities and the sorts of instruments and resources we want to have at our disposal. But the compass also explains why we want to have those resources. It's absolutely true that the Indo-Pacific was not the only consideration when the compass was put together. We have to look globally at the threats and challenges that we face. And I think, again, coming back to what I was just saying about the security and defense agenda, when you look at this, I mean, we have all the classic security and defense challenges there. There's a lot of ink already being generated on the rapid deployment capability, for example, where this might be used, what it might be used for, what sort of capabilities do we need to develop in order to be able to do this in the way in which it's portrayed. And I don't think, my personal view, I don't think in the first instance we are looking at the Indo-Pacific as the most likely place for the deployment of the rapid deployment capability. My expectation, again, this is my personal view, is that it's most likely to be used in our broader neighborhood. But nevertheless, when you look at the breadth of the topics that we're discussing, and when, emerging in disruptive technologies, hybrid threats, cyber threats, maritime security, these are all topics that are absolutely at the heart of the geopolitical questions that you were talking about in the Indo-Pacific region. And I think, very much indicative of the way in which the EU wants to engage in the region. Okay, fair enough. Thanks. We'll come back to you. So take some more of that lemon honey. Alvina, turning to you, I mean, as mentioned by Alison, this was largely a member state-driven process on security and defense, policy areas which largely fall outside of the European Parliament's competence reach. And in fact, the EP was not really involved in the drafting process of the strategic compass at all. Yet, as your work on EU-India connectivity issues in the Pacific shows, there are wider security interests at play in this vast region from the Red Sea to all the way down to Tasmania. So could you reflect both on the European Parliament's role in this process, but then also on the substance relating to the Indo-Pacific, please?
Thank you so much, Stephen, and thank you all organizers, speakers, participants. It's very timely discussion indeed, and about the EU's role of on the security of Indo-Pacific, as we live in a very difficult time, as you all know. And the return of this power politics is very definite, and the tensions are rising. So what we are now asking in the European Parliament from ourselves and also in this event is what the EU can do for peace and stability in this very moment. What are the concrete actions? Of course, when we look at this power politics and how it plays out, there is a major role of US, China, and the whole Indo-Pacific region. I must say about the strategic compass and about the discussions in the parliament that all of the, members of the parliament from nearly all of the groups share the view that Indo-Pacific is important to the EU. And while you know that it's also very much in the competencies of the member states, but I think that there should be a more prominent role for the EU as well. Why the EU is interested in the region is very easy to understand. And while we adopted the strategy of the region last year, it was actually quite timely because, 40% of the EU's global foreign trade is passing through the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean. And it's very clear that in even this regard, EU wants to have a stake at the safe and secure maritime environment of the Indo-Pacific. But it's of course about a lot more than that. It's about the security of these nations. It's about the security of these people in the area, and how can EU work to balance out the tensions that there have been. Of course, it's very clear that the China's economic and military expansion and the growing US emphasis in the region have also made these tensions grow. But it's a very central region now in global politics. And the strategic compass, when it was adopted last month, it was actually long awaited because for the first time, the EU member states pulled together a commonly adopted strategy on how they intend to develop the security and defense cooperation, and outline a bit more about how EU could become a relevant security provider within and beyond its borders. However, of course, this compass outlines many of these existing policy objectives and measures from different strategies that we have, but it does not necessarily provide so much new in addition to those. And this is something that is a disappointment for many of us in the time of war in Europe, especially, and in a time of very global tensions rising. And there has also been a lack of parliamentary oversight in the whole process, as you mentioned. So this is something that is very complex. Always the member states don't even have such a wide understanding of possibilities that there might be in the Commission and in the Parliament. But this is, of course, just my opinion. But I hope that there would have been even a lot more mutual sharing of ideas and discussion even during this process. Well, the Indo-Pacific strategy then is naturally much larger in its scope. So these most pressing issues that have been identified for the EU especially are the maritime presence, security and cooperation with ASEAN from EU. And the emphasizing of this maritime presence highlights the challenge of the EU's role, because as you know, the EU does not have common maritime capacities, but it relies fully on the member states. And of course, when it comes to the Indo-Pacific, because in its all vast expanse, the naval presence of the EU member states also is very limited. France is the only member state with a territory in the region, and they are having some credible naval presence. There was, of course, some testing of waters by German and Dutch.
Sorry, Alvina, could you reposition a little bit your microphone?
Let's see. Is it better now? If I
a little, yes. Here. Still, you're a bit faint.
Let's see. Okay. So I can.
We can hear you. Maybe it's a question of speaking up a bit more.
Okay, maybe I will try that. But definitely, I think that China and US are able to deploy this naval presence at a very different scale, as you know. So, and that should be balanced strategically by the EU as well. However, I think that there is also, it's very much, related to the political will of the member states. So that is what plays the key role here about the naval presence. Of course, through this political, economic, and diplomatic way, the EU should be a relevant partner to these countries and organizations in the region. And it's clear that the EU's role and influence in the region must come through these partnerships, because only with these regional partners, EU can work towards securing the open sea lines of communication in the Indo-Pacific. And of course, the ASEAN is the key stakeholder to participate with, and a natural choice. But of course, there is much more need for bilateral partnership. India, Japan, Republic of Korea, Indonesia, Vietnam, and I hope that EU should be able to establish a relevant partnership in this region and promote this rule-based regional security, which is really our main goal there. And also building on the lessons learned from Gulf of Guinea, for example, I think the EU can expand the concept of coordinated maritime presence also in the Indo-Pacific. But finally, one hole in the strategic compass addressing the Indo-Pacific that I would like to mention is the global gateway, because that provides EU a way to participate not only in economic but also in the political arena and to contribute on the stability, development, and security of the region. But the strategic compass fails to recognize this. So this is really forgotten in the text. And to finish off, I think overall I feel the strategic compass, as it was long evaded, but it does not provide enough guidance in many issues, also in the EU security and defense cooperation in general, but neither in the Indo-Pacific. So a lot more has to be done in that regard, and when the compass is evaluated, this should be addressed. And it will have an evaluation at some point of time, and I hope that the parliamentarians would be even a lot more involved in such a process so that it would actually be democratic. Unfortunately, these tensions in the area are not disappearing, so this is exactly the right time for EU to do a lot more. Thank you all so much.
Thank you very much, Alvina. You've touched on a lot of issues, and we will certainly come back to some of them. Certainly the global gateway and the rules-based international security order that you're at least after, that the EU is supposedly after in the Indo-Pacific, is something to touch upon. But you mentioned right at the start, of course, that one of the main interests of the EU in the Indo-Pacific is to secure trade routes. You mentioned 40% of trade volume passes through the South China Sea. And you also mentioned that there's only, less than a handful of member states really able and willing to send frigates to secure those sea lines of communication, which is, a key phrase basically in both the strategic compass as well as the Indo-Pacific strategy is concerned. Where France is the only resident power, so to speak, and the others, Germany, Britain, of course, is still there, but not an EU member state anymore. I mean, it really shows the importance of relying on partnerships. I suppose that's what I'd like to pick up as a bridge to Professor Tokochi. Of course, from a Japanese perspective, and certainly in his previous capacity at the Ministry of Defense, will have thought long and hard about these partnerships with the EU. So we're very keen to hear from you. And then I would like to bring in Susanna and touch upon some of the issues, Alvina, that you raised.
Okay. Good morning or good afternoon, depending where you are located. First of all, let me thank Center for European Policy Studies and in particular, Professor Stephen Bloxman for having me in this very important event. But I'm very, very sorry to say that the connection is very unstable and all of you are often cutting out. So please allow me to speak with audio only for the next several minutes in order to make it more stable. Russian invasion of Ukraine is a brutal act to try to annihilate an independent sovereign state against a long-established international norm. It's a serious challenge to the rules-based order, but it doesn't make sense to assert that international law is useless or incompetent. Even in this decentralized world, the notion of the rules-based order is not a hollow idea. As a British expert said long time ago, no political society can exist without law. So I believe that the EU's intention to intensify support for the global rules-based order by working together through its strategic partners, of course, including in Asia, is well received. Its global perspective and partnership with extra-regional like-minded countries are important. Just as European security is indivisible, global security is indivisible. Russia is an Asian power too. North Korea's ICBM-capable missiles could reach out to Europe. North Korea may be more interested in Russia's oil. China and Russia jointly said recently that there is no limit in their friendship. Japan neighbors on Russia as well as China and North Korea. There is no such thing as security only for Europe or only for the Indo-Pacific or only for East Asia. The war in Ukraine will be protracted. The economic sanctions will continue to be imposed for a long time, and accordingly, Russia will decline. Instead, China will continue to rise, and the US-China competition will be intensified, affecting every corner of the globe, even including the Arctic. Transatlantic pivot to Asia is not a rhetorical flourish. It will continue to be real. In fact, a few of European states are resident powers of the Indo-Pacific. I believe that the EU's intention to promote an open and rules-based Indo-Pacific security architecture through its Indo-Pacific strategy is a clear sign of its continuous global engagement. I'm not sure if the Europeans have enough military assets for that purpose, but Indo-Pacific countries, including Japan, will be able to provide environment for supporting European forces operations, particularly naval ones. Recently, reciprocal access agreement, RAA, was concluded between Japan and Australia, and now the UK and Japan have been working on it. I personally look forward to reciprocal access agreements between Japan and the EU countries in future, capitalizing on the EU-Japan strategic partnership agreement, particularly Article 29 on maritime affairs. There are a number of serious impacts of the Russian aggression of Ukraine on the Indo-Pacific security. In the interest of time, I just mentioned the following two issues. First, North Korea will intensify its nuclear ambition. North Korea probably believes that Russia's nuclear intimidation makes US and NATO hesitate in direct military involvement in Ukraine. If so, North Korea will never abandon its nuclear weapons. In the past, North Korea clearly said that Iraq and Libya collapsed and that Syria was attacked due to the lack of nuclear arms. North Korea probably believes that if Ukraine had not given up its nuclear weapons it inherited from the former Soviet Union, Russia could not have invaded. Today, Russia is heavily sanctioned. China is colluding with Russia. They jointly criticize, quote unquote, ideologized Cold War approaches. So it's hard to imagine for them to agree on any further sanctions on North Korea, despite its North Korea's ICBM launches and possible nuclear test explosions in near future. Second, the Japanese are more concerned about the possibility of China's use of force against Taiwan. Even before the Russian invasion, the expression that the Taiwan contingency is a Japan contingency was becoming more popular in Japan. in the Russo-Chinese joint statement on February 4th, Russia confirmed China's position on Taiwan. According to a Japanese opinion poll conducted last month, 77% of the respondents were concerned about the possibility that the Russian act would affect the situation involving Taiwan. A Ukraine analogy on Taiwan will continue, and 79%, almost 80% of the Japanese respondents believe that even their own security has been threatened by the Russian act in Europe. I believe that Japan must contribute to the enhancement of the international legal order as a beneficiary of the stability generated by the rules-based order. As a part of it, the UN should be reformed, as Zelensky touched upon in his address to the Japanese and also to the UN Security Council. The UN Security Council should be reformed. EU and Japan should jointly look into this issue in accordance with the strategic partnership agreement. Also, retrieving Indo-Pacific maritime balance of power in our advantage is important in order to buttress the rules-based order, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. Filling the power vacuum, particularly in the South China Sea and also in the Southern Pacific Islands region, together is very, very important. And one final caveat, China is a partner for cooperation as clearly written in the strategic compass. Coexistence with China is possible as we coexisted with the arch enemy, the Soviet Union, in the Cold War days. But China is a more formidable adversary. It's a systemic rival as expressed also in the strategic compass. Cooperation with China is not risk-free, even in addressing matters of global concerns such as climate change. Some of key natural resources necessary to produce renewable energy will be easily weaponized by China. So we must discuss more about how to deal with China. Of course, the discussion about Russia is important, but at the same time, we have to discuss much more about China. I'd like to stop here.
Thank you very much, Professor Dokuchi. First of all, I think Japan's support to Ukraine and also its alignment in the G7 with positions and actions of the EU as well has been very well noted here in Europe, and certainly is a tribute to the strengthening partnership between the EU and Japan. I take up from your opening remarks, indeed, the general notion that in this hyper-connected world, security is indivisible, and that we need to think about both Russia and China in this respect. You mentioned you're not sure about the EU's assets in security and defense, and then quickly pointed to the fact that Japan had already struck up agreements with Australia and the UK. Of course, the Indo-Pacific strategy of the EU was launched or maybe eclipsed by the launch of AUKUS just on the eve of the presentation of the Indo-Pacific strategy. So keenly aware in Europe that that more structured forms of cooperation between the EU and Japan should build on the strategic partnership agreement that you mentioned. And perhaps we can, in the discussion, dig a little bit deeper whether there's actually an appetite, politically speaking, in Tokyo to structure more permanently the cooperation with the EU's CSDP missions and operations, its security and defense operations in the Indo-Pacific. Because if I understand it correctly, and we actually have a paper out that SEPS.
I think you articulated what I would like to say in a more elegant way. Thank you very much.
More than you're keen to comment on, I understand. Well, China, of course, has been mentioned. Susanna, the strategic compass repeats the famous multifaceted characterization of China in the EU's view, but it also takes comfort in the concept of inclusivity of security and defense in the Indo-Pacific, which to my mind, when looking at China and China's actions, repositioning vis-a-vis Russia over Ukraine, in fact, invites ambiguity. When that concept of inclusivity is applied to cooperation that includes China. After all, one might assume differences in values and conflicts of interests with China, while perceiving cooperation as a lever to encourage Beijing to adhere to internationally accepted norms and standards. And this famous Wandel durch Handel concept, which has been washed out as far as cooperation with Russia is concerned. But it seems this approach still chimes with the practice of some EU member states and the EU's partners in the region as well, India, which for obvious geographical reasons cannot afford to distance itself too much from China. And so I suppose what I'm getting at, and what I'd be interested also to hear from you throughout your remarks, is that such an EU approach, in fact, risks diverging from those of supposedly like-minded countries like Australia, like the United States, who increasingly frame their multilateral cooperation in the region as an effort to confront and to contain China. So is in fact this strategic compass, which is not, does not engage with, as I mentioned before, balancing out interests and values per se vis-a-vis China or any other actor around the world. Is it a helpful guide to navigate security and defense cooperation in the Pacific?
Asking me? You are muted.
Asking Susanna, and then I'll get back to you as well.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Stephen, for the invitation. It is really an honor to join the panel, and I look forward to discussing in more detail, and I hope I can contribute with my own views and thoughts from Taipei, also trying to incorporate the whole EU-Taiwan framework into the larger context. So I would first like to start with talking a little bit about the context, and then placing the EU-Taiwan, also this approach, the newly emerging approach towards Taiwan, also in the context. So, of course, as it was already well described by previous speakers, we are right now in a new geopolitical and geoeconomic reality, which is defined by economic coercion and disinformation. And I think these two tools are often used in mutually reinforcing ways, like two sides of the same coin by authoritarian governments. We also see systemic rivalry strengthen, and trade being used for political reasons or being increasingly weaponized. Now, in this context, and with Russia's war in Ukraine, I think, and we can all agree here, that the EU has been seeking to redefine its global role. And this was reflected by several communications going back several years. And this, of course, includes not just the Indo-Pacific strategy, the global gateway, a connectivity strategy before that, but also efforts to upgrade the industrial policy, and also now turning towards hard security. The aim, I think, on the European level is clear, is to address the vulnerabilities that recent developments have exposed, and also the EU's strategic dependencies, and to equip itself with tools to protect its interests and to move towards autonomy for defense, meaning to act independently when needed. Now, I believe here that the EU's ties with China and a focus on the Indo-Pacific are both two pillars essential to these reflections in its efforts to redefine its role, because the Indo-Pacific is a region that has become the key driving force of trade-led growth, but also a region where China's coercion has been most acute. Here we can mention Australia, Korea, Japan, of course, Taiwan. Now, in this context, and with COVID further exposing more vulnerabilities, there has been this awareness, and Russia's war has accelerated this, of course. We now see member states display political will to act and to strengthen their convergence. I think this is one important observation. But in order to maintain that emerging convergence, the political will need to remain. So this is more something for the future to be seen. But also China's economic coercion against Lithuania, affecting intra-European trade in the past year, this is also another element that pulled member states closer together. Now, I would like to pick out one sentence I thought was a good statement from the Compass, that when it says that the EU, the Compass aims to equip the EU with the mindset, the means, and the mechanisms to defend our union, our citizens, and our partners. I think it really sums up the reality of where we are, where we're missing that mindset and also the means, but we have the ambition on a European level to play a bigger role and to defend ourselves and the partners. And this brings, of course, the idea of partners and partnership to the core also of my few thoughts that I'm sharing with you, which was already abundantly stressed previously, but this is something I also subscribe to in terms of the importance of partnership in this process of reflection of redefining the EU's new role. Now, I think there is a new opportunity and a more realistic chance that this emerging unity that I spoke about as a result of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, that this emerging unity will benefit the EU's self-perception as a global actor that is equipped and both ready to act. And this will have direct implications that will benefit EU-Taiwan relations. I also think that the Compass also makes it clear that the EU's approach to China is in line with our 2019 strategic outlook, simultaneously a partner, a competitor, and a rival. This was also reconfirmed by the EU-China summit. And here, so I would like to transition now to Taiwan in this context, because as I spoke briefly of the EU self-perception, I think it's very useful to think and start talking a little bit about Taiwan's self-perception, because I think since COVID, Taiwan's global image has improved a lot. Its successful pandemic response, its generosity to its neighbors and beyond, and its crucial role in global value chains and critical technology has all elevated Taiwan's strategic importance. And this process of internationalization is something that Beijing did not anticipate, nor did Beijing anticipate that there would be such a sustained level of European interest in Taiwan. And I stress sustained level because this is a process, and maybe I can come back when I speak more about EU-Taiwan relations later on or in the Q&A. So Taiwan's self-perception, I believe in this context, is more to see itself as a member of the international community in spite of its diplomatic isolation and its abnormal international status, and is seeking to become also a global high-tech innovation hub, which increases its strategic value in the region and globally, also for Europe. Taiwan also found its way into the political discourse a lot, to a great extent in Japan, but also Australia, the US, and in the EU level, EU language, EU narrative of the institutions, but also in member states, some more than others, as we know, which is a significant change from the past. And so right now, I think Taiwan is seen more as a reliable partner and a reliable provider of chips and a like-minded democracy. And this is also reflected by the fact that Taiwan is in the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy, referred to several times, also recognized that a conflict in the Taiwan Strait may have, a quote, may have a direct impact on European security and prosperity. So mindful of its international limitations, I think for Taiwan, the challenge is to circumvent its isolation. And this can only be done through practical cooperation and partnership. So again, we circle back to the idea or the centrality of partnerships, not just in the Compass, but clearly also in Taiwan's self-perception. So going forward, the next step should be to see Taiwan not just as a reliable partner, as I described, but an indispensable partner for the EU to push back against the challenge that China poses to the international order, and also to rebalance its ties with China. So I believe I mentioned coercion, and I would like to come back to it because We spoke of the classical military defense and security tools, but also going beyond that. And I think here it's important to talk about the threat of weaponizing trade. And so going forward, I think the EU must invest more to understand better coercion with Chinese characteristics, the kind of informal coercion that is more difficult to detect, but its impact is just as damaging potentially as a formal coercion or formally declared coercion. But also this coercion has limitations. And then also for the EU should leverage its economic strength and market access. In the EU-China summit, we saw the EU clearly say that should China interfere with Western sanctions on Russia, there would be consequences. And this is, I think, using and leveraging the economic strength that the EU has, because, and I'm coming to a close of my thoughts here, that I think the economic weight that the EU has is its strongest asset, but also openness is what made the economic weight be what it is. So rebalancing ties with China is part and central to how we also look at the Indo-Pacific, within the Indo-Pacific strategy. And finally, I mentioned political will. I think that will be essential in order to sustain the emerging unity, but also to further develop our approach towards Taiwan, because there is a clear understanding that the geopolitical risks and implications of an assertive China in the Taiwan Strait have implications for the EU. So it's up to political will to move forward from understanding to taking measures. And I also strongly believe that the EU's relations with Taiwan will benefit from a more effective EU foreign and security policy within the compass, and also through the Indo-Pacific strategy. And it will help rebalance ties with China, as well as allow the EU to leverage its economic weight. So I think I will stop here, not to take too much time, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Susanna. You're right, of course, to point to economic security issues, the type of economic warfare that we see going on below the radar. Colleagues of mine actually counted the number of times that hybrid threats are mentioned in the strategic compass, and I think the number was something like 46 times. So there is ample attention, of course, for those issues, but the question is whether the capabilities that are being developed, or proposed at least being developed in the next few years through the Security Compass document, actually touch upon these issues of economic warfare that you mentioned. I suppose that's really a different type of action, but it does emphasize, of course, the integrated approach that the EU should take to external threats, crises, and conflicts. I would like to go back and also invite, of course, our speakers to have a look already at the first questions that have come in from our own online audience. I would like to first invite, well, all three of you. It seems that we've lost Alvina for the moment. She might come back. Bad connection apparently from Strasbourg. But I would like to come back to this container concept, which is almost always put down as an axioma. This international rules-based order. Can we really speak of that still? What does it mean in the context of the strategic compass? And what does it mean in relation to the Indo-Pacific? The way I read it is that, of course, the contestation on this international rules-based order is getting more and more acute, with the division of global power blocks in a way. So what does the EU hope to realize through its strategic compass in this particular sense in the Pacific? That would be a first question, but also in terms of partnerships, then returning or picking up on two of the questions which have been posed in the Zoom function. First, a question for Alison, whether the strategic compass contemplates the organization of joint exercises with partners. I mean, there's a bit of that, of course, which was already mentioned on the maritime, coordinated maritime presences, etc. But how far does it go in joint exercises? And to both you and Mr. Tokuchi and Susanna Ferenti, I think the question, okay, about partnerships, is the EU perceived as a credible partner in security and defense for Asian countries? So first, Alison, please.
Thank you very much. I'm still just about making sounds, hopefully, still reasonably coherent. I mean, on the general question, you know, the strategic compass is not aimed at any specific region. You know, it's really about what sort of actor does the European Union want to be. It's, as I said at the beginning, it's something of a declaration of ambition or of intent. And there's a lot in here about the work that the European Union has to be able to do itself, between the member states, with the European institutions, collectively, to be able to act in the way that it wants to act, to be able to deal with the sorts of security and defense challenges that it's seen. And that's really where you see the bulk, you know, the first three sections of the compass: act, secure, and invest. They're really about how the European Union can become a more credible and effective security and defence actor. And then the last chapter talks about how we want to take this work forward together with partners, but it doesn't replace, as I said at the beginning, what was in the various joint communications. I don't know if you can hear the rain, but it's absolutely deafening. And we have quite a lot already in that document that still stands. So the strategic compass builds on existing policy frameworks like the joint communication on the Indo-Pacific. And I think we have to see those two documents very much together when we look at how we want to map out the work going forward. I think one thing that's really important, and it's relevant also to the issue of joint exercises when it comes to partnerships, it's also very important to understand what the partners want. It's not a partnership if the European Union turns up in Japan or Indonesia or Vietnam or India and says, hi, we've decided to make you our partner. You know, it doesn't work like this. Partnership has two partners to it, and it's important that we make sure that we're working together with our partners also on issues that they find important, that they find interesting. And that's not something, again, that you conjure up overnight. It's relatively new for the European Union to position itself as a security and defense actor, certainly very new to position itself as a security and defense actor in the Indo-Pacific region. So these are conversations that we're still in the relatively early stages of, that we're starting to have with our partners in the region, all of which have their own interests, their own priorities, their own way of working with the international system, their own preferences on how they want to engage in security and defense. And that's why I emphasized the sort of tailored, no one size fits all nature of these relationships, because they will be very different, and it will take into account, for example, the national preferences of some of our partners not to participate or not to contribute directly to EU CSDP missions and operations. Some may choose to do that, and they will be very welcome. Some may decide that this is not how they want to take that cooperation forward, but they might be very interested in pursuing more cooperation on the ground between their own engagements overseas. So there are lots of different ways that we can work together with our partners, and this is something that we have to work out and map out and develop together with them in a way that makes sense for us and that makes sense for them. I'm just looking at the strategic compass. I have the rather lovely collector's edition that is now available in limited numbers. You need to know people to get one of these, but it says here, conduct by 2023 live maritime exercises with partners in the Indo-Pacific, in addition to more frequent EU port calls and patrols. When we're talking about maritime assets, of course, these are assets that belong to our member states. So it's absolutely essential that our member states are joined up and have a clear view about where those priorities are, where those exercises should take place, which ports should be the subject of those port calls. But it's also, as I said, which partners want to work with us. And we've had quite a lot of experience in recent months with the, I mentioned before, the exchanges with Operation Atalanta. This is something that we really want to build on and to develop. Atalanta can only operate within its established area of operations. So that's in the western part of the Indo-Pacific region, if you like, and the same will be true as well for the new coordinated maritime presence in the Northwest Indian Ocean. And we're exploring ways in which we can associate third partners with that, because that's a new tool that we've developed. This is only the second iteration, so it's a relatively new instrument. But I expect in the future we will be looking to carry out much more ambitious engagement there. That's very much up to the member states, but it's also very much up to the interests of the partners.
A perfect bridge indeed to those partners. Hideshi Tokoshi, seen from Japan, it takes two to tango, of course. The EU is willing. What about Japan?
Well, thank you very much for that very important question. I have 2 points. First of all, particularly from a naval point of view, Japan and EU have a history of mutual cooperation. You know, since 2009 or 10, EU and Japan have been cooperating with each other off the coast of Somalia and in the Gulf of Aden for counter-piracy operations for a long time. And when they began to cooperate, you know, a decade ago, the annual incidents exceeded 200, but now it's almost none. So if we cooperate with each other, of course, it is not just a cooperation between EU and Japan, but if truly multilateral cooperation is made, that kind of non-traditional security challenge will diminish. That's what EU-Japan cooperation in the Gulf of Aden shows us. So that's one thing. And secondly, EU-Japan strategic partnership agreement. It has a lot of things, including non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, cyber issues, maritime issues, outer space cooperation, sea-bound risk mitigation, counterterrorism, etc., etc. It's a mutual agreement, and actually, I believe that the Japanese side treasures the agreement. So we have already momentum to promote mutual cooperation in security affairs.
We take good note, of course, of the cooperation in the Gulf of Aden. We've seen a lot of that. I mean, the emphasis seems to be very much on countering piracy and terrorism. Is there a scope? You mentioned there, at least the phraseology suggests that there is a much wider scope. But concretely, given assets, where do you think the next realm of cooperation might lie for Japan, EU in security and defense?
Well, it's hard to tell, but I just would like to say that last year, when a German frigate visited Japan, it was very well received and highlighted. I believe I've heard that the German frigates visit to Japan was more highlighted in Japan than in Germany. So I think the Japanese expectation for European engagement with the efforts to retrieve balance of power, particularly naval balance of power in East Asia, That's very much expected, particularly in the South China Sea region. China always, capitalizes on the power vacuum created in that region. If we just look back at the history of the South China Sea, it is very much evident. So it is very important to retrieve the maritime balance of power in that region in our own advantage. So, even dispatch of one frigate is welcomed by the East Asian side, particularly by the Japanese side.
Okay, and there's a couple of follow-up questions as well. I would like to invite you, Mr. Tokoshi, to also have a look at the second question, which was posed in the Q&A box to pick up later. But first, I would like to turn to Susanna and ask the same question that I posed to Mr. Tokoshi, which is, the perception from Taiwan, where you sit, and you've been focusing on other Indo-Pacific countries as well, of course, in your research, about the EU's actorness in security and defense in the region. How is it perceived?
Yeah, well, that's also a good question. Seen from Taiwan, I think first thing I would highlight, and it probably is not something, because here in Taiwan is not very well known either, that the top investor in Taiwan is the European Union. And so what we see in the Indo-Pacific strategy articulated through a more importance paid to Taiwan is this understanding that the EU has its own interest to protect here in the Indo-Pacific, not just the top investor in Taiwan, but also in the region, and also a development cooperation partner. And so this understanding is, of course, from the European side, but how this is received in Taiwan for long, as we all know, Taiwan has been and still is to some extent a sensitive issue. I mean, clearly for Beijing, it is a non-negotiable issue, which has made European member states always agree to sort of treat Taiwan as a sub-chapter of EU-China relations, one that requires the EU's agreement that this is that it respects its one China policy and it remains committed to the one China policy. But of course, this, as I was explaining earlier, this has changed in the past 2 years in particular, and this has changed really the perception of also how the EU sees Taiwan, but also how Taiwan sees the EU. And this more willingness in the EU to be serious about rebalancing its relations with China is also makes Taiwan a much more important and relevant actor for the EU. And this is a process. So I always say here in Taiwan, because first of all, what I observe is that the EU is far, and the EU is difficult to understand, also often for Europeans ourselves. And in Taiwan, when we say the European Parliament, and I talk about the European Parliament's resolution on Taiwan, it's not very clear what that means and what the weight of such a resolution is. And I'm very fortunate, or I'm very happy to be here and to conduct these discussions within Taiwan, because it just shows how important it is to invest more in these discussions and to shape this debate, because there is a momentum, and this momentum is also was also facilitated by this mutual goodwill. So we saw the Taiwan's participation in the efforts to fight COVID in Europe with the mask diplomacy, then the vaccine diplomacy with mostly Central Eastern European countries. And most recently, we saw Taiwan's proactive engagement in helping Central Eastern European countries deal with the refugee crisis as a result of the war in Ukraine. And Taiwan, the government and the people expressed their interest, support, solidarity, and financial assistance also to help these countries. And I think this is a very important participation in international efforts and also part of Taiwan's self-perception. Of course, the reaction from Beijing to this is that Taiwan is exploiting a crisis, which is something that is not the view in Taiwan. But overall, again, I highlight more the economic dimension and the economic weight, especially here, given that if we speak about the future of Taiwan in the Strait and China's increasing assertiveness, what role the EU could play? This is another question that I often receive here. Of course, there is no agreement or there is no joint European position on how the EU would engage in a situation in the Taiwan Strait. I believe that the EU would work in partnership with the US and with Japan. And I think a last thought here, because I mentioned Japan, to maintain this momentum and also to find ways to see Europe more as a reliable partner and a constant partner, is to really find ways to integrate Taiwan in existing frameworks of cooperation. So here I would mention the GCTF, which is the global cooperation framework. Wait, what is exactly? I always get confused. Global Cooperation and Training Framework. It's a more difficult abbreviation. So it is between the US, Japan, or the Japan-Taiwan Exchange Association and Taiwan, as used as a platform to allow to share Taiwan's expertise with the world. And I think this is, for example, a platform that the EU should more actively engage with. So this is how I see going forward in terms of the partnerships.
You touch on very important issues, which I would like to tie in with two questions which came in and put to Alison Weston and Hideshi Tokoshi. Returning to dedicated scenario-based discussions, both at the political level, tabletop exercises, joint exercises in the field, especially as far as securing sea lines of communication is concerned. It seems that the understanding of the international rules-based order, which I touched before, in maritime security terms is very well understood and pegged to UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. There seems to be no difference, even if major partners, strategic partners of the EU and Japan, of course, have not signed up to UNCLOS. But that's not really my question. My question is, in military terms, with all the ambitions that are being formulated through the strategic compass, with these exercises, etc., in protecting, in particular, the straits. And Susanna, of course, mentioned the Taiwan Strait, and the question in the Q&A function, there's a reference to the Malacca Strait. You have the Bab al-Mandab Strait. So arteries through which a lot of trade passes overseas. If these need to be secured in military terms, and if we want to start with exercises, then, and this was the last point that Susanna mentioned, we need to train ourselves in trusting each other to share information and adopt a certain strategic culture to the objectives that are formulated in this respect. That, to my mind, seems an Achilles heel for any type of cooperation in this field. If we cannot establish the trust to share unclassified information with each other, then are we building basically Fata Morganas? Alison.
Thank you. Quite a lot more questions than I think I can or would even want to try to answer. I mean, there was a I just wanted to first of all come back to the previous point about cooperation with Japan, because I want to underline or reinforce what Professor Tokuchi said about the existing framework for cooperation with Japan, where we do have already quite a lot of exchange on quite a broad range of topics, which can also be understood as security and defence topics. So again, as I said at the beginning, we're not starting from scratch, but I think we have to emphasize, and the strategic compass makes this clear, it is talking about military assets, it is talking about military capabilities. There's quite a big section talking about the EU developing its own military capabilities in a different way to the way that we've done it before, in a more joined up and coordinated manner. But at the same time, the strategic compass isn't only about military capabilities. And I think we have to understand that the sorts of security and defence challenges that we're looking at, they do need a military dimension, but they're not only about military capabilities. And I think if we only talk about where are your ships, we're going to miss also a big part of the conversation. And you touched on that with your points about building strategic culture, about building common understandings of how we address the challenges and understand what those challenges are. In a sense, the strategic compass, that reflection process, that's why I emphasize the reflection process and the common threat analysis at the beginning, has been very much about doing that amongst our member states, about building a much more solid and collective basis for taking the work forward, about understanding what kind of actor we want to be in terms of security and defence. And that's something that doesn't appear overnight. You don't build this in a few days or a few weeks. It's something you build through experience and through cooperation over time and investment over time. And amongst member states, we've had quite a long-term investment already. We're building on already quite a lot of advances in the security and defence area, but we still have, as the compass makes clear, a great deal left to do with partners. Again, we are building on this. This is why these joint exercises, for example, with Atalanta are important. Yes, those are focused on counter-piracy and counter-terrorism in that specific context, but it's also about building that habit of working together, about building trust and knowledge and experience between our different militaries, between our diplomatic, political, military establishment, and building up those experiences in that common strategic culture. So those sorts of cooperation, I think, have a consequence or an importance and a value that go much further than the narrow focus on counter-piracy, which is Atalanta's primary target. When it comes to the South China Sea or the Malacca Straits, I don't think, and again, this is my personal view, I don't think that this is going to be the first place that the European Union is going to identify as a priority for sending maritime assets. And again, I have to underline this, and perhaps in response to some of the questions, the European Union is not a military alliance. It doesn't have own military capabilities. So when we're talking about the deployment of military assets, these are assets that belong to the member states, and it is the member states who have to decide collectively how those would be deployed and how those would be deployed with the European Union branding or identity attached to them. That doesn't mean that member states are not also engaging bilaterally. And Professor Tokuchi mentioned a German frigate visit in Japan. We also know that a number of our member states have their own Indo-Pacific strategies and also have a maritime presence in the region. And that is not precluded. That remains something that is entirely within national decision-making capability. But I do expect member states to be working to coordinate much more on the way in which they engage from a maritime perspective. But even again, and I want to come back to this, I want to emphasize, of course, the presence of ships is important, but this isn't the only part to maritime security. And there's a lot of work that the European Union is already doing in the region, together with partners such as Japan, to support the capacities of countries in the region, for example, to have more maritime domain awareness, to improve the information sharing. We have an important project called Crimario, which is active in the region, that's focused, for example, on these kinds of issues, on allowing interoperability and information sharing.
Can you briefly spell it out, the Crimario?
No, I would have trouble. It's CRIM. I'll write it in the chat. That's probably easier than trying to spell it out.
It's basically a coordinated effort, second project edition to improve maritime situational awareness and coordination between member states in operative terms, no?
Yeah, I don't want to try and go into too much details about Crimario, because this will direct us into technical details. But I think important to say we have Crimara. We also have another project called ESIWA, which is enhancing security with and in Asia, which is also looking at specific policy areas where we can enhance our cooperation with some of our partners on really concrete, practical issues, the stuff that perhaps doesn't get the headlines. Ships sailing through the Taiwan Strait, that gets a lot of headlines. But really, there's a tremendous amount of work in terms of building common understanding and knowledge, helping to support capabilities, and helping to work in these I won't say new because they're not new, non-traditional, less traditional areas of security and defense, where there's already a tremendous amount and where we expect to be doing much more with partners going forward. I think with Japan as one of our key partners, of course.
Yeah, to my mind, this is exactly where the complementarity between the strategic compass and the Indo-Pacific strategy lies. I mean, the Indo-Pacific strategy seems to gravitate towards more economic connectivity cooperation, with a limited attention to security and defense, where of course the strategic compass is fairly light, perhaps in regional terms, regional focus on this region. And you mentioned before that in partnership cooperation, especially with NATO, the EU will a fortiori act regionally rather than further afield. I think those are good points raising. But I would like to pose the same question to Mr. Tokuchi, basically, and also invite you, of course, to reflect on the specific question which was posed to you in the Q&A function.
Well, first of all, in response to the question posted on the Q&A box, which is about the solar-based, where is it? Yeah, where is it? I'm sorry.
Space-based solar power.
Space-based solar power. To be honest, I can't afford any expertise to talk about that issue. But Japan is much dependent on fossil fuel imported from overseas. But if Japan becomes less dependent on fossil fuel, then it may affect Japan's priority on the defense of sea lines of communication. But anyway, Japan is a maritime country and dependent on much on foreign trade. Therefore, I do not necessarily think that it will affect much on the Japanese, naval thinking. Anyway, the South China Sea is much important, and in relation to that, I do not expect that the EU or EU member states will deploy their naval asset to East Asia, including the South China Sea, much. But it is more important for EU and Japan to cooperate to help weak Southeast Asian countries establish or strengthen their maritime security and maritime safety or maritime law enforcement capabilities in order not to create any power vacuum over there. In the short run, it is more important to deploy military or law enforcement assets over there. But in the long run, it is more important for us to help Southeast Asian countries to, enhance their own capabilities, of course, including maritime domain awareness capability. So that's where we can, Japan and EU will be able to cooperate with each other.
I think that's an important point you raise. Of course, the EU and Japan seem to recognize the need to avail themselves of whatever means they can muster to avoid the deterioration of the security situation in both the South China Sea, the East China Sea. But as Susanna also pointed, the immediate flashpoint or next flashpoint everyone considers, especially after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, is of course the move of China on Taiwan. And so here, Mr. Tokushi, I would like to ask Susanna the same question. To what extent can and should the EU and Japan better reflect on how they could jointly increase the cost for China and help deter basically its actions or deterioration of the security situation in the seas?
Well, from a Japanese point of view, security or defense of Taiwan is just, that's exactly a matter of Japan's own security. The one Japanese island is only 110 kilometers away from the main island of Taiwan. It is very close to Taiwan. Therefore, if there is a military conflict between China and Taiwan, definitely a part of the Japanese archipelago will be involved. So the conflict, military conflict involving Taiwan will definitely affect the security of Japan. And also, the U.S. commitment to Taiwan is usually called strategic ambiguity, but the U.S. commitment is less and less ambiguous. According to the recently published U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy, the United States will support Taiwan's self-defense capability to ensure an environment in which, the next part is very important, in which Taiwan's future is determined peacefully and also here in accordance with the wishes and best interests of Taiwan's people. I think in this phrase, the US commitment to Taiwan is very, very explicit. So I think that the Chinese side believes that the US will definitely be involved in the conflict between Taiwan and China. So therefore, the Japanese role is to assist the US military operations from Japanese bases. So the wartime host nation support, that's very important. Of course, Japan is providing dependable stationing environment for the US forces for a long time, but Japan has to do a lot more. And so I'm not so sure whether the EU-Japan cooperation will be on about military cooperation, but diplomatic cooperation, economic cooperation in order to defend Taiwan. That's very important, I think.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time, but I would like to do a final round as well. So Susanna, please.
Well, I do agree with Mr. Tokuchi on the need of cooperation between the EU and Japan in terms of the situation in Taiwan. I also think that we need to find a way where the EU remains committed to working together with Japan and with Taiwan. So this way of sharing expertise, and here in terms of practical cooperation, I think of countering hybrid warfare or gray zone activities from China, cyber warfare, and working in this field together. I think this is clearly in the interest of all parties. So this is where I see also the strategic compass potentially bring value, because one of the sections is right, it's secure, and cyber warfare gets a lot of attention. And we know that Taiwan has been dealing with disinformation and hybrid warfare from China for decades. And this is something that the European Parliament has recognized by sending a delegation to Taiwan last year to look into ways to cooperate on disinformation. So I see this as an important area of cooperation and also willingness to pick up both between the EU and Japan and with Taiwan's participation.
Yeah. It's something that I would have liked to ask Alvina to comment on, but it seems we've lost her for good. Alison, I know you have to run, and we have to wrap up as well. But I would like to give the final word to you, and feel free, of course, to pick up on any of the remaining questions still in our Q&A box as well.
Thank you. I don't have a great deal to add. I mean, I think, as I said at the beginning, the strategic compass has a lot about what the EU needs to do for itself and amongst itself and with itself. It's also a declaration of intent about how we want to use our existing instruments in a different way, or in a more joined up way, a more coherent way, that we want to make sure that we respond to the changing sort of challenges that we see around us, including the geopolitical challenges. And I think it reflects the recognition that we can't address security and defense policy in a vacuum. I mean, we have, and as Susanna pointed this out, the European Union is a complicated outfit, even for those of us still working in it. It's not always easy to understand, and we have certain structures and capabilities and competences that have been imposed or have been created due to the way that our treaties, our legal basis has been constructed, which creates certain divisions of responsibility between the institutions and the member states. But I think we have to understand the compass also as a declaration that we want to use those instruments and those different tools in a much more coherent way to address the way that we see the challenges. And in the specific area of the Indo-Pacific, I think we should see the strategic compass very much together with the Indo-Pacific strategy from last year. As you said, Stephen, the Indo-Pacific strategy focuses on different policy areas. You know, there's a lot there about connectivity, about economic cooperation, and our strategic compass focuses more on how we can take our security and defense partnership forward with partners from the region. But in the end, the two things have to be seen as coherent. It will certainly be the basis on which my team will be taking our work forward as we engage in building our relationships further with the partners. But again, I want to emphasize, partnerships means partnerships. It means we have to understand the interests, preferences, priorities also of our partners. And that is a process. We're not starting from scratch. We have a great deal of cooperation already ongoing. But as we move towards a new level of ambition for the European Union, that means a new level of ambition also in those partnerships. And that's not something that's going to happen overnight. It's going to be something that we have to invest time and energy and patience and persistence to show that we are reliable partners and that we are here for the long haul. So plenty of work for us to do, plenty of things to keep me and my team busy in the coming months, and plenty of things, of course, to be discussing with you and all of your other partners. Thank you very much.
And on that note, we'll be very happy to facilitate, of course, such discussions. We continue our own research on these topics as well. And as mentioned in passing, we've actually today published a paper on EU-Japan security and defense cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, coming out of the two strategic documents the EU has launched in the last half year. So please do visit our website for further updates on events, on publications. I would like to thank, on the audience's behalf, on SEPS's behalf, of course, the speakers for giving us their valuable insights, their time, for responding to the questions, my own and those of our online audience. And thank you very much for that. And we look forward to being in touch, of course, in the future again. With that, we close our seminar, and I wish you all a good day, remainder of the day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.